So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This will be our second last session of our Coach Socialization series. And we're really excited to have Danielle back on here to talk to us more about mental performance. So Danielle is a mental performance consultant at the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic, but also was in a coaching role for the past year and will still be continuing on with coach enhancement within the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. So earlier in the year, she was on here to talk about Visualization 101, but today we'll be talking about anxiety reduction techniques. So again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. But Danielle, I'll get you to take it away from here.
All right, thanks so much, Kirsty, and thanks everybody for joining on this gorgeous, I think it's Tuesday. Some presentation that I get lots of requests on are anxiety reduction techniques. So this is something that I've presented on quite a bit, and something as a coach that I was really interested in with my own athletes and actually with myself. And probably why I got into mental performance in the first place, because I used to have, as an athlete, some nerve situations before I went on and competed. So this is an area that's really close to my heart. So today what we're going to be talking about, I did a kind of a condensed version of this PowerPoint because sometimes it goes on for about an hour and a half, and with the timeline today I wanted to keep it a little bit shorter. We're going to briefly talk about what is anxiety and what is our stress response. And then we're going to talk about what is, on the other end, ideal performance state, as some people refer to as IPS, or you might have heard of it as IPS. Then we'll talk about what induces anxiety, and the major part of this presentation is how to help your athletes reduce anxiety. So those anxiety reduction techniques. So I like to start off this presentation with this story about Alex Honnold. Some of you may have heard about Alex Honnold. There's a great, I think it's Netflix, out there on Alex about free solo, I believe it's called. And Alex Honnold is the only person to free climb El Capitan and the fastest on the Triple Crown in the States. And they've done a lot of research on his brain, in that for most people being in this type of situation where you have no harness, nothing supporting you, if you fall to your death. And what they've found is, in this type of situation, his nerves, he doesn't have any nerves. So the part of his brain that should be lighting up, that fight or flight response, is actually quite quiet in this particular situation. Whereas if you put anybody else, I'm sure any of you in this situation, including myself, our fight and flight response would be going through the roof. And so our fear area of the brain would be lighting up. And on the other hand, you put him in front of a room to public speak, and his fear response is quite high. So it's a very interesting psychological, I guess, research on him, in that what is fear invoking to him is not necessarily fear invoking to others, and vice versa. So what I wanted to get out of this was that anxiety is different for each person. So what invokes anxiety is different for each person, and how we express our anxiety is different for each person. So that is really important to keep in mind with your athletes, and also with yourself. So what is anxiety? For today's presentation, it's just going to be a general term for nervousness, fear, apprehension. Sometimes we have feelings associated with anxiety, something like heart palpitations. We often hear our athletes are saying our heart is beating out of our chest. We get the jitters. Sometimes we get the jitters so much that we actually get tension, sweating, shortness of breath. If we get really nervous, we get nauseous, and sometimes we even throw up. And obviously, so it affects how we feel, but it also can affect how we behave, and can cause different, oh, sorry, I just got out of there. It can cause, yeah, like I was saying, different physical symptoms. The difference between stress and anxiety, we use them really interchangeably, is stress is a response to a perceived threat, whereas anxiety is the reaction to the stress. And once again, what is stressful to one person is not necessarily stressful to the next. So we have two different kinds of anxiety. We have state anxiety and trait anxiety. And trait anxiety is kind of one of those characteristics. So if someone is just characteristically anxious, that would be trait anxiety. State anxiety refers to something where when the stimulus is there, we are anxious. When that stimulus is gone, the anxiety goes away. So if we were to think of someone that may be fearful of spiders, they're not an anxious individual, but if you put a spider in front of them, they're going to get feelings of anxiety. You take that spider away and the anxiety goes away. Performance anxiety is actually a type of state anxiety because we are anxious in that situation where we feel we need to perform. Sometimes it's a competition, sometimes it's a presentation. There are different situations that we can have performance anxiety, but it's a state anxiety in that it goes away as soon as we're out of that situation. What can happen, however, is that when state anxiety, or when that state anxiety gets too high because our resources, or we don't feel our resources meet the needs or meet the demands. So we may believe to have too much stress. And when we have too much stress, we actually have a lower performance level. So we have a decrease in our athletic performance due to too much perceived stress. And that perceived stress tends to increase on game day or in particular competition settings because athletes have an audience. They have high expectations of their success, so they have major expectations on themselves. And lastly, they perceive others to have high expectations of their success. And those others tend to be, number one, their parents, and number two, their coaches. So even though we as coaches may not have those expectations, athletes can sometimes create what they think your expectations are. So it's important to also be really clear on what your expectations are of athletes. So why does anxiety occur? Well, anxiety comes back to the classic fight or flight response. And after lots more research into the fight or flight response, we now see that it's actually not just fight or flight, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And what happens in the fight or flight response is that our sympathetic nervous system basically hypes up to get us ready to either take off or fight. So it's like that release of adrenaline to prepare us for either of those situations. When we get beyond that sympathetic nervous system into the parasympathetic nervous system, we actually freeze. So it goes when our system becomes so overwhelmed with anxiety or with the nerves or with that perceived stress, we can get to a freeze state. And you can sometimes see that when athletes in, for example, performance sports forget their routines. Or you can see that in sports where athletes are making really poor mistakes that they would never normally make. And that would be an example of some freeze in sports. So what is ideal? We talk about ideal performance state a lot when it comes to sports psychology. And it's important for people to understand, athletes in particular, that we do want you to have stress. It is important for you to have some stress or some perceived stress or some perceived emotion or some emotional arousal. Because if we're under aroused, we are bored. We have a lack of attention to the task at hand. On the other hand, if we're over aroused emotionally, we can't actually think straight. That's when we play that what if game. It's when we are constantly overthinking or overanalyzing. And actually, when we get into that state, our brains also can't really good at making decisions. So we need to find an in between. And this zone of optimal functioning or ideal performance state it varies per person, but also per sport. We see a lot of highly physical sports, like sprint sports, like football, like hockey. You do want a high level of emotional arousal. Whereas on those other sports like curling, lawn bowls, some of the ones that require a little bit more specificity but are more on the mental side and low on the physical side, you want very low arousal levels. But at the same time, that's kind of like a rule of thumb. It's all individual. So sometimes people actually really like high stress levels or like to be highly emotionally aroused when competing, whereas some people just like to be really chilled out before going in. So it also depends on the individual and not just the sport. Research shows that the ideal performance state is kind of made up of these slices of pie. And it's not to say that you require all of them to be in your ideal performance state, but they're all characteristics of what it is to be in your IPS. So the number one being the absence of fear. And I know Simon was on a little while ago talking about fear of failure and talked a little bit about that. And so having no fear of failure in performance is critical to be in your ideal performance state. So athletes are not over analyzing when their ideal performance state. There's a flow to it. Instead they have a narrow focus on the activity itself. So they're in that present moment. They know what they're doing in that moment. There's a sense of effortlessness, and that doesn't mean that it is easy, but it might feel fluid or easier than normal. There's a sense of personal control. So it's not that my opponents are such and such, so that's impacting my performance, or the ref made a bad call and that's impacting my performance. I feel in control of my own performance. And finally, there's a distortion of time and space. And that means, and many of you have probably witnessed this or felt this, that a game can go by in a second, or a game can feel like it's going on forever. And time and space, you may feel like 1,000 meters feels like it's far, or you've done a kilometer in a second. So that time kind of slows down or speeds up depending on the person. So just going to throw that out to all of you and ask, what do you typically do in response to an anxious athlete in competition? And I should change the slide, out of competition. How do you, as a coach, help to reduce anxiety in your athletes? And Kirsty, I'll get you to share, because I can't see the chat box. So just throw it in the chat box if you have, or unmute if that's possible, if you feel comfortable.
Hi Danielle, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. So what I typically do is I talk to them, like basically I just do conversation with them, what's happening, what are you thinking right now, what happened there, why your performance went low, or why it's like too much, why you're shaking or something like that. So just started with the conversation and then jotted down some points and try to explain to them, okay, this is how the sequences will be, or this is how it should be happening, you should do like that or something like that, like, break it down afterwards, after having conversation.
So are you talking about after the competition or in the moment?
In the competition.
Okay.
When we have like little break times when we have in between.
Okay. Yeah, some of those sounded really good, and then some of those actually would be good to kind of rephrase sometimes how you ask those questions. That's little tricks to how you ask some of those questions are important.
Yes, yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, I'll continue on. So I'm going to start from further out. So I'm not going to jump right into in competition. I'm going to start further out because we don't want to do anything just in competition for the first time. Everything that you do in competition should be something familiar to the athletes. So the best way to help is to start out of competition. We do not learn in that moment. We're not able to absorb in that moment something new. So in a competition, everything should be old hat. We've already gone through this. I know what you're talking about. This is nothing new to me as an athlete, or this isn't sounding unfamiliar coming from you as my coach. So 4 things, and we'll talk about them all a little bit more in a second. So improved awareness, creating a culture, taping your feedback, and contacting a mental performance coach or consultant. Awareness, and I spoke to this, I believe, in our first chat on visualization. Awareness is that first mental skill that everybody needs to develop, and you as coaches need to develop it as well. But so understanding yourself, what are your stressors? What makes you nervous as a coach? How do you respond to that? Maybe there's ways in which you are acting that you might not notice, but your athletes can pick up on. So sometimes that nervousness that might not be noted by us, or that we might not have awareness of. And it's funny, when I talk to athletes, sometimes they can pinpoint right away. I know my coach is nervous when he or she starts to do this. They start talking faster. They start asking me these questions. They know it. They're very astute. Athletes always can pick up on those little nuances of your behavior as a coach. So being aware of what those are, and even having those conversations with your athletes, it also allows them to feel like it's normal. It is normal for us to have these reactions, and talking about them from your perspective might help to also get them talking about it as well. So what are your stressors? How do you respond? What language are you using when you're nervous? I know some coaches start to swear a lot when they're nervous, or when they're highly emotionally aroused. So on the athletes, knowing what their stressors are. So not just what, but who. Sometimes it's a teammate. Sometimes it's a parent. Sometimes it's an opponent. So knowing what they are. Sometimes it's a particular situation. So it can be a who or what, and how do they respond in those particular situations. So once again, the who has a positive impact on them as well as those who have a negative. And what does their self-talk sound like? Because you're not in their heads, we're not in their heads. It's really important for them to be aware of that self-talk. If we don't have this information, we can't really help our athletes in the most effective ways. So this is a really, like, an awareness talk with your athletes is really useful at the outset of a season. So before we get into heavy training, before we get into competition season, these are the kinds of conversations you should be having with your athletes. Second is to create a culture, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about this over, just probably in general, but it's becoming more and more the cornerstone to a good team is their culture. And part of a culture that can help to reduce anxiety is to incorporate meditation and breathing techniques into your practices. Once again, that's a classic go-to in competition that hasn't been practiced well enough beforehand. So practicing different breathing techniques, using meditation, getting your athletes to get apps on meditation if you don't feel comfortable going through it yourself with them. Getting them to practice a breathing technique before they go out and perform a skill. Once again, coming from a performance sport, oftentimes I would incorporate a breathing exercise before they went out and ran through their routine. So they got used to that as kind of their pre-routine practice. And so when in competition, they had that. It was just their regular training that they did in everyday practice. Empower athletes to take risks versus avoid mistakes. And that comes down, once again, to what kind of language we use. So really reinforcing that risk-taking behavior, that smart risk-taking behavior, and minimizing punishment for having made a mistake when making a risky move. And then lastly, the attitude for gratitude. We know that being grateful and regularly practicing gratefulness actually helps to rewire our brain, because we are negatively focused. We remember negative, we give more weight to negative. We need basically double the amount of positive to equal one negative. So by regularly focusing on the positive, and it doesn't mean that something positive has to happen every day, but that we're grateful for, maybe it is that we're grateful for a challenging situation because we learned something from it. So practicing that on a daily basis is good for helping to focus on the positives. And that creates a positive culture within your team. And actually helps to rewire their brains long-term so that they are equally, or can be equally focused on the positives as they are on the negatives, and more likely to be more resilient in the long run. As a coach, it's really important to taper your feedback. And I like to kind of use the analogy of, if we're 3 months before, think of your athletes your athletes' brains as sponges. And then 3 days are in competition more so. Their brains are a little bit like rocks. They do not absorb much in that particular situations. So all of our information around competence should be given out well before an actual competition. So 3 months before competition, 70% of our feedback should be around competence and 30% around confidence. 3 weeks before competition, we should be going at about 50-50. And 3 days before competition, we should be really reinforcing confidence and still giving some feedback around competence, but much less than we would normally. Once again, remember that they're not actually able to absorb that much information that close to a competition. Finally, if some of these things are outside of your realm, or you don't have time to incorporate these into your daily practices, to get somebody else involved as part of your coaching staff, whether that's a mental performance coach, another coach. It's also really good to have that second voice. Athletes are used to hearing from you on a regular basis. It's always nice to have another voice telling usually the same thing to your athletes, because sometimes the way in which somebody else says it rings true, or just the fact that not that novel voice or that new voice saying the same thing is actually absorbed a little bit better. If you can think about it as a parent, if I'm constantly telling my kids to pick up after themselves, they just tune me out after a while. But if someone else were to come in and tell them to pick up after themselves, they probably would, because once again, it's someone new, but they're hearing that same message. So how can you help in the moment? First and foremost, getting them to take a deep breath. Well, actually, sorry, I'm going to talk about these all in detail in a second. So get them to breathe, get them to focus on the controllables, both physical and mental, use visualization, and keep information short and simple. So first, the breathing. Get them to breathe. Get them to take a nice deep breath, and it's actually even helpful if you do it with them because they don't feel silly doing it. So in through the nose, out through the mouth. Engaging your diaphragm, and what that means is really filling up your lungs as you breathe in and deflating your lungs as you breathe out. That's different from just kind of a chest breathing. If we're just breathing into our chest, we're not totally filling up our lungs and therefore not engaging our diaphragm. For a breathing exercise to work, the key is to engage the diaphragm. Okay, if we do not engage it, we're not going to have the same response. The diaphragm is key, basically, to this breathing. So in through the nose, out through the mouth. There's different kinds of breathing. You hear box breathing or circular breathing. There's relaxation breathing. And there's plenty out there if you wanted to Google it or YouTube it. There's actually ones that can take your athletes through them as well. And for instance, relaxation would be a 1-to-2 ratio where you would breathe in for 4 counts and out for 8 counts. Rhythmic breathing is in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. And those would be used in different situations or based on the individual's preferences. So the key to the diaphragmatic breathing is what it does, and once again, why the diaphragm is so important in that situation, is it actually creates the relaxation response. And if you have the fight or flight response coming from your head down to your body, the relaxation response is the opposite of from your body up to your brain. And where that fight or flight response is release the adrenaline, get ready for fight or flight, high emotional arousal. And if I've gotten too much of that my performance at risk, this relaxation response actually sends messages back up to our brain and just basically tells it to chill out. And it kind of like helps to turn off that faucet of adrenaline. And with that, we can kind of reduce our nerves to get back into that ideal performance state. So think of the fight or flight response on one side or from the top down, and the relaxation response from the bottom up. And if you need a better balance, you need to use a breathing exercise to kind of reduce that fight or flight response. And once again, the diaphragm is the one that sends the message up to the brain. So we really need to engage the diaphragm in that breathing exercise to get the relaxation response. Focus on the controllables. So have a pre-competition and a competition plan that has been practiced regularly. You can focus, okay, well, we know 30 minutes before we go on, we're doing XYZ. When they know that's what they're doing and it's part of a routine, it's part of a plan, they feel more in control. Feeling more in control and more prepared increases our confidence and feeling of preparedness for whichever stressor we're about to tackle. So having those plans and practicing those plans actually help to reduce our nerves. Get them to focus on the skills they need to do. So rather than focusing on winning or focusing on beating a certain team or playing really well, which in the moment, the athlete's brains can't compute that. Think of it as something too heavy to digest in the moment. Their brains cannot digest that information in the moment. So talk about what does it mean to go fast. For example, if we're talking about a speed sport, 1 foot in front of the other, turn those feet over. It could be about execution of a skill, needing to suck in their stomach, tighten up their abs, push their shoulders back, being really specific on what they need to do on that skill. And one thing actually that I took from a recent webinar that I took on coaching was, if you can use an analogy in those particular situations, like I want you to feel like you're landing like a cat versus land softly. Try to use analogies as much as possible, or even better, use a situation, a past situation where the athletes performed it well. Because in that situation, the athlete's going to be using memory, which is in a different part of our brain, than thought. So if they can remember that, that is way more useful in the moment than trying to get them to think about something. So memories are really important. So if you have kind of like a back pocket full of memories that you can get your athletes to use, or that you can throw out there for them to remember in the moment, very useful. And then also for team sports, obviously, getting the focus to be on working as a team. So when we're talking about communication, say, I want to be the loudest bench out there. That's something that's easily within their control. We know quiet benches are usually the losing benches. Get them to be more communicative. And that's something that they can easily use and apply right away. And then once again, having them focus on their personal best performance. How do you want to be remembered today? So make it kind of more big picture if they're getting too stuck in the weeds on the specifics. So how do you want to be remembered today? You want to have your best performance, and maybe that's just that you had the most fun performing that day. Okay. Get them to visualize. This should also be part of a pre-competition or competition routine. It should not be kind of ad-libbed in the moment. So visualization should be structured into your practices and structured into that pre-competition routine or that competition routine. When doing visualization, make sure that it's one event at a time and it's executing perfectly, but also encountering difficult circumstances. And it can be done by their perspective or by kind of like a bird's eye view. Either is great, both is even better. And finally, we want to keep information short and sweet, especially in competition. You are going to basically get 8 seconds of their attention at a time. So we want to keep it very simple. Keeping that feedback sandwich technique. What went well? What needs to be improved? And it can either be an overall positive statement like, go get them, you got this, or it can be how to improve that. I just need you to push your shoulders back a little bit. I just need you to look up more. I need you to communicate to this position more often. So keeping it really short and sweet. And those would be the 4 things kind of in the moment. So just kind of an overview of what we talked about today. Remembering stress and anxiety can come from anywhere, and it's different per person. And it impacts us differently, and we show it differently. Once again, I don't know if I mentioned this. I had a slew of teammates that love to talk when they got nervous, and then there's athletes that just get absolutely quiet when they get nervous. So realizing that nervousness can show in either way. Become aware of your stressors as a coach and how your athletes can tell that you are nervous. So having that conversation with your athletes. understand your athlete's anxiety as best you can. So understanding what their stressors are and how they think they show it. They may be completely wrong. I've had that quite often where someone says, oh, I get nervous because, and I show it by, you know, stretching or going out and training too much beforehand. And that actually isn't what is happening. So it's important for them to know what that self-talk is as well. You can help by create a culture and training, and that would be 100% my biggest bit of advice for today. Is this needs to be a part of your training plan, your yearly training plan, and this has to be embedded in basically every practice. Adjust your feedback, so taper your feedback in the moment, getting them to breathe, getting them to focus on what they can control, getting them to use the visualization, and keeping your information short and simple. And that is it. I guess I did shorten it quite a bit. Gonna come back here and see if we have any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. And two people did chime into your question, but it came in like right after you moved on.
Oh,
so I
sorry.
didn't want, no, that's okay. I just didn't want to interrupt you. So I'll just read them out loud for those that aren't able to read the chat box. So generally speaking, this person tries to get their mind on other things. So usually that means getting them to narrow their focus onto a sole objective, but sometimes it may mean something completely unrelated so that the source of the anxiety does not come up.
Okay.
And then someone else said, I remind them that others feel like this too, even coaches, and I give some of my own examples.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, very important to normalize anxiety, especially in those types of situations. Because if they feel like they need to hide it and cover it up, that's not going to be useful in the long run. And by you opening up about it as well, it kind of opens the floor for them to feel comfortable in doing the same.
And there was just one other comment in regards to like being focused on process goals. So checking off boxes over outcome goals.
Yeah, so that's right. Definitely process goals, number one thing to focus on. And once again, comes back to the language that you as a coach use and what you're talking about in the change room or in the locker or in the like on the field right before they go out and compete, is to focus on what those process goals are. And there's tons of process goals that are easily measurable, or there's tons of process goals that are SMART, specific, measurable, adjustable, realistic, and time-based. So it is really important that those are reviewed, because that also helps for the athletes to understand what your expectations are of them in that competition.
Danielle, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know what is the trait anxiety you mentioned?
What is trait anxiety?
Yes.
Trait anxiety would be someone who actually suffers from anxiety and may need anti-anxiety medication to help their trait anxiety. So someone who has trait anxiety is more likely to get nervous, is more likely to experience state anxiety. So they would get more nervous more easily, and that nervousness would last longer or feel more intense. But a trait anxiety has to do with when they're not in a particular instance. It's not a situation, it's not a thing. They have it all the time.
Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Danielle? Feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. All right, we have a quiet bunch today. Well, if you have any questions, like I said, just comment or unmute, but we will start to close things off. So thank you so much, Danielle, for coming back and talking to us about a topic that many coaches have requested and continue to request. So we will be posting this online, so definitely feel free to review it and go back onto our YouTube page. And I also linked Danielle's previous session about visualization, which definitely ties into this. And then the fear of failure by Simon, which also associates with this. So definitely check those out as well. And then as for our last coach socialization session, we're hoping to have that next week with Lorraine. So Lorraine Lafreniere is the CEO of Coaching Association of Canada. So she's going to be coming on to talk to us about safe sport and kind of what that's going to mean now with like COVID restrictions and the virtual coaching context. And then apart from that, we are busy preparing for National Coaches Week. So for those who may know of National Coaches Week, it's in September, from September 19th to 27th. And in Nova Scotia, we're going to be celebrating from the 21st to 25th online. So we're going to be hosting a virtual conference. And so that will be running from 7 to 9 p.m. Atlantic time from the Monday to Friday of National Coaches Week. And we're going to be having at least 3 presenters each evening talk about a variety of topics. But the focus of the conference will be on safe sport, specifically diversity and inclusion. So definitely encourage you guys all to keep your eye out for that. More information will be posted at like the end of August, early September. But next week is our last coach socialization series, so we do hope to see you guys all there. And again, Danielle, thank you so much for this awesome presentation, and it's just so beneficial to us as coaches, but also for our athletes. So thank you.
Yeah, it's nice to get to see everybody. Hey, Steve.
Mm-hmm.